Chapter 3. Yet, while dressing for dinner, the idea exfoliated, as only a living thing exfoliates. I saw in George Isley this great question mark that had not been there formerly. All have, of course, some question mark, and carry it about, though with most it rarely becomes visible until the end. With him, it was plainly visible in his atmosphere at the heyday of his life. He wore it like a fine curved scimitar above his head. So full of life, he yet seemed willingly dead. For, though imagination sought every possible explanation, I got no further than the somewhat negative result that a certain energy, wholly unconnected with mere physical health, had been withdrawn. It was more than ambition, I think, for it included intention, desire, self-confidence as well. It was life itself. He was no longer in the present. He was no longer here. Some countries give, while others take away. I find Egypt difficult to deal with. I find it. And then that simple, uncomplex adjective, strong. In memory and experience, the entire globe was mapped for him. It remained for Egypt, then, to teach him this marvelous new thing. But not Egypt of today. It was vanished Egypt that had robbed him of his strength. He had described it as underground, hidden, waiting. I was again aware of a faint shuddering, as though something crept secretly from my inmost heart to share the experience with him, and as though my sympathy involved a willing consent that this should be so. With sympathy, there must always be a shedding of the personal self. Each time I felt this sympathy, it seemed that something left me. I thought in circles, arriving at no definite point where I could rest, and say, "That's it, I understand." The giving attitude of a country was easily comprehensible, but this idea of robbery, of deprivation, baffled me. An obscure alarm took hold of me, for myself as well as for him. At dinner, where he invited me to his table, the impression passed off a good deal, however, and I convicted myself of a woman's exaggeration. Yet, as we talked of many a day's adventure together in other lands, it struck me that we oddly left the present out. We ignored today. His thoughts, as it were, went most easily backwards, and each adventure led, as by its own natural weight and impetus, towards one thing, the enormous glory of a vanished age. Ancient Egypt was home in this mysterious game life played with death. The specific gravity of his being, to say nothing for the moment of my own, had shifted lower, farther off, backwards and below, or, as he put it, underground. The sinking sensation I experienced was of a literal kind. And so I found myself wondering what had led him to this particular hotel. I had come out with an affected organ the specialist promised me would heal in the marvelous air of Helwan. But it was queer that my companion also should have chosen it. Its clientele was mostly invalid, German and Russian invalid at that. The management set its face against the lighter, gayer side of life that hotels in Egypt usually encourage eagerly. It was a true rest house, a place of repose and leisure, a place where one could remain undiscovered and unknown. No English patronized it. One might easily, the idea came unbidden suddenly, hide in it. "Then you're doing nothing just now," I asked, "in the way of digging? No big expeditions or excavating at the moment?" "I'm recuperating," he answered carelessly. "I have had 2 years up at the Valley of the Kings, and overdid it, rather. But I'm by way of working at a little thing near here across the Nile." And he pointed in the direction of Saqqara, where the huge Memphian cemetery stretches underground from the Dachûr Pyramids to the Giza monsters, 4 miles lower down, There's a matter of 100 years in that alone. You must have accumulated a mass of interesting material. I suppose later you'll make use of it. A book, or... His expression stopped me. That strange look in the eyes that had stirred my first uneasiness. It was as if something struggled up a moment, looked bleakly out upon the present, then sank away again. More, he answered listlessly, than I can ever use. It's much more likely to use me. He said it hurriedly, looking over his shoulder as though someone might be listening, then smiled significantly, bringing his eyes back upon my own again. I told him that he was far too modest. If all excavators thought like that, I added, we ignorant ones should suffer. I laughed, but the laughter was only on my lips. He shook his head indifferently. They do their best. They do wonders, he replied, making an indescribable gesture as though he withdrew willingly from the topic altogether, yet could not quite achieve it. I know their books. I know the writers, too, of various nationalities. He paused a moment, and his eyes turned grave. I cannot understand quite how they do it, he added half below his breath. The labor, you mean, the strain of the climate, and so forth. I said thus purposely, for I knew quite well he meant another thing. The way he looked into my face, however, disturbed me so that I believe I visibly started. Something very deep in me sat up alertly listening, almost on guard. I mean, he replied, that they must have uncommon powers of resistance. There, he had used the very word that had been hiding in me. It puzzles me, he went on, for, with one exception, they are not unusual men. In the way of gifts, oh yes, it's in the way of resistance and protection that I mean, self-protection, he added with emphasis. It was the way he said resistance and self-protection that sent a touch of cold through me. I learned later that he himself had made surprising discoveries in these 2 years, penetrating closer to the secret life of ancient sacerdotal Egypt than any of his predecessors or co-laborers. Then, inexplicably, had ceased. But this was told to me afterwards, and by others. At the moment, I was only conscious of this odd embarrassment. I did not understand, yet felt that he touched upon something intimately personal to himself. He paused, expecting me to speak. Egypt, perhaps, merely pours through them, I ventured. They give out mechanically, hardly realizing how much they give. They report facts devoid of interpretation. Whereas with you, it's the actual spirit of the past that is discovered and laid bare. You live it. You feel old Egypt and disclose her. That divining faculty was always yours. Uncannily, I used to think. The flash of his somber eyes betrayed that my aim was singularly good. It seemed a third had silently joined our little table in the corner. Something intruded, evoked by the power of what our conversation skirted, but ever left unmentioned. It was huge and shadowy. It was also watchful. Egypt came gliding, floating up beside us. I saw her reflected in his face and gaze. The desert slipped in through walls and ceiling, rising from beneath our feet, settling about us, listening, peering, waiting. The strange obsession was sudden and complete. The gigantic scale of her swam in among the very pillars, arches, and windows of that modern dining room. I felt against my skin the touch of chilly air that sunlight never reaches, stealing from beneath the granite monoliths. Behind it came the stifling breath of the heated tombs, of the Serapeum, of the chambers and corridors in the pyramids. There was a rustling, as of myriad footsteps far away, and as of sand the busy winds go shifting through the ages. And in startling contrast to this impression of prodigious size, Islay himself wore suddenly an air of strangely dwindling. For a second he shrank visibly before my very eyes. He was receding. His outline seemed to retreat and lessen, as though he stood to the waist in what appeared like flowing mist, only his head and shoulders still above the ground. Far, far away I saw him. It was a vivid inner picture that I somehow transferred objectively. It was a dramatized sensation, of course. His former phrase, "Now that I am declining," flashed back upon me with sharp discomfort. Again, perhaps his state of mind was reflected into me by some emotional telepathy. I waited, conscious of an almost sensible oppression that would not lift. It seemed an age before he spoke, and when he did, there was the tremor of feeling in his voice he sought nevertheless to repress. I kept my eyes on the table for some reason, but I listened intently. "It's you that have the divining faculty, not I," he said, an odd note of distance even in his tone, yet a resonance as though it rose up between reverberating walls. "There is, I believe, something here that resents too close inquiry, or rather that resists discovery, almost takes offense." I looked up quickly, then looked down again. It was such a startling thing to hear on the lips of a modern Englishman. He spoke lightly, but the expression of his face belied the careless tone. There was no mockery in those earnest eyes, and in the hushed voice was a little creeping sound that gave me once again the touch of goose-flesh. The only word I can find is subterranean. All that was mental in him had sunk, so that he seemed speaking underground, head and shoulders alone visible. The effect was almost ghastly. "Such extraordinary obstacles are put in one's way," he went on, "when the prying gets too close to the reality. Physical, external obstacles, I mean. Either that, or the mind loses its assimilative faculties. One or other happens." His voice died down into a whisper, and discovery ceases of its own accord. The same minute, then, he suddenly raised himself like a man emerging from a tomb. He leaned across the table. He made an effort of some violent kind, on the verge, I fully believe, of a pregnant personal statement. There was confession in his attitude. I think he was about to speak of his work at Thebes, and the reason for its abrupt cessation. For I had the feeling of one about to hear a weighty secret, the responsibility unwelcome. This uncomfortable emotion rose in me as I raised my eyes to his, somewhat unwillingly, only to find that I was wholly at fault. It was not me he was looking at. He was staring past me in the direction of the wide, unshuttered windows. The expression of yearning was visible in his eyes again. Something had stopped his utterance. And instinctively I turned and saw what he saw. So far as external details were concerned, at least, I saw it. Across the glare and glitter of the uncompromising modern dining room, past crowded tables, and over the heads of Germans feeding unpicturesquely, I saw the moon. Her reddish disk, hanging unreal and enormous, lifted the spread sheet of desert till it floated off the surface of the world. The great window faced the east, where the Arabian desert breaks into a ruin of gorges, cliffs, and flat-topped ridges. It looked unfriendly, ominous, with danger in it. Unlike the serener sand dunes of the Libyan desert, there lay both menace and seduction behind its flood of shadows. And the moonlight emphasized this aspect. Its ghostly desolation, its cruelty, its bleak hostility, turning it murderous. For no river sweetens this Arabian desert. Instead of sandy softness, it has fangs of limestone rock, sharp and aggressive. Across it, just visible in the moonlight as a thread of paler gray, the old camel trail to Suez beckoned faintly. And it was this that he was looking at so intently. It was, I know, a theatrical, stage-like glimpse, yet in a seductiveness most potent. "Come out," it seemed to whisper, "and taste my awful beauty. Come out and lose yourself and die. Come out and follow my moonlit trail into the past, where there is peace and immobility and silence. My kingdom is unchanging underground. Come down, come softly, come through sandy corridors, below this tinsel of your modern world. Come back, come down, into my golden past." A poignant desire stole through my heart on moonlit feet. I was personally conscious of a keen yearning to slip away in unresisting obedience, for it was uncommonly impressive, this sudden haunting glimpse of the world outside. The hairy foreigners, uncouthly garbed, all busily eating in full electric light, provided a sensational contrast of emphatically distressing kind. A touch of what is called unearthly hovered about that distance through the window. There was a weirdness in it. Egypt looked in upon us. Egypt watched and listened, beckoning through the moonlit windows of the heart to come and find her. Mind and imagination might flounder as they pleased, but something of this kind happened undeniably, whether expression in language fails to hold the truth or not. And George Isley, aware of being seen, looked straight into the awful visage, fascinated. Over the bronze of his skin there stole a shade of gray. My own feeling of enticement grew, the desire to go out into the moonlight, to leave my kind and wander blindly through the desert, to see the gorges in their shining silver, and taste the keenness of the cool, sharp air. Further than this with me it did not go, but that my companion felt the bigger, deeper draw behind this surface glamour, I have no reasonable doubt. For a moment, indeed, I thought he meant to leave the table. He had half risen in his chair. It seemed he struggled and resisted, and then his big frame subsided again. He sat back. He looked, in the attitude his body took, less impressive, smaller, actually shrunken into the proportions of some minuter scale. It was as though something in that second had been drawn out of him, decreasing even his physical appearance. The voice, when he spoke presently, with a touch of resignation, held a lifeless quality, as though deprived of virile timbre. "It's always there," he whispered, half collapsing back into his chair. "It's always watching, waiting, listening. Almost like a monster of the fables, isn't it? It makes no movement of its own, you see. It's far too strong for that. It just hangs there, half in the air and half upon the earth, a gigantic web. Its prey flies into it. That's Egypt all over. Do you feel like that too? Or does it seem to you just imaginative rubbish? To me, it seems that she just waits her time. She gets you quicker that way. In the end, you're bound to go." "There's power, certainly," I said, after a moment's pause to collect my wits. My distress increased with the morbidness of his simile. "For some minds there may be a kind of terror, too, for weak temperaments that are all imagination." My thoughts were scattered, and I could not readily find good words. "There is startling grandeur in a sight like that, for instance," and I pointed to the window. "You feel drawn, as if you simply had to go." My mind still buzzed with his curious words. In the end, you are bound to go. It betrayed his heart and soul. "I suppose a fly does feel drawn," I added, "or a moth to the destroying flame. Or is it just unconscious on their part?" He jerked his big head significantly. "Well, well," he answered, "but the fly isn't necessarily weak, or the moth misguided. Over-adventurous, perhaps, yet both obedient to the laws of their respective beings. They get warnings, too, only when the moth wants to know too much, the fire stops it. Both flame and spider enrich themselves by understanding the natures of their prey, and fly and moth return again and again until this is accomplished. Yet George Isley was as sane as the head waiter, who, noticing our interest in the window, came up just then and inquired whether we felt a draught and would prefer it closed. Isley, I realized, was struggling to express a passionate state of soul for which, owing to its rarity, no adequate expression lies at hand. There is a language of the mind, but there is none as yet of the spirit. I felt ill at ease. All this was so foreign to the wholesome, strenuous personality of the man as I remembered it. "But, my dear fellow," I stammered, "aren't you giving poor old Egypt a bad name she hardly deserves? I feel only the amazing strength and beauty of it, awe, if you like, but none of this resentment you so mysteriously hint at." "You understand, for all that," he answered quietly, and again he seemed on the verge of some significant confession that might ease his soul. My uncomfortable emotion grew. Certainly he was at high pressure somewhere, and, if necessary, you could help. Your sympathy, I mean, is a help already. He said it half to himself, and in a suddenly lowered tone again. "A help!" I gasped. "My sympathy! Of course, if—" "A witness," he murmured, not looking at me. "Someone who understands, yet does not think me mad." There was such appeal in his voice that I felt ready and eager to do anything to help him. Our eyes met, and my own tried to express this willingness in me. But what I said I hardly know, for a cloud of confusion was on my mind, and my speech went fumbling like a schoolboy's. I was more than disconcerted. Through this bewilderment, then, I just caught the tail end of another sentence in which the words, "relief it is to have someone to hold to when the disappearance comes," sounded like voices heard in a dream. But I missed the complete phrase and shrank from asking him to repeat it. Some sympathetic answer struggled to my lips, though what it was I know not. The thing I murmured, however, seemed apparently well chosen. He leaned across and laid his big hand a moment on my own with eloquent pressure. It was cold as ice. A look of gratitude passed over his sunburned features. He sighed, and we left the table then and passed into the inner smoking room for coffee, a room whose windows gave upon columned terraces that allowed no view of the encircling desert. He led the conversation into channels less personal and, thank heaven, less intensely emotional and mysterious. What we talked about I now forget. It was interesting, but in another key altogether. His old charm and power worked. The respect I had always felt for his character and gifts returned in force, but it was the pity I now experienced that remained chiefly in my mind. For this change in him became more and more noticeable. He was less impressive, less convincing, less suggestive. His talk, though so knowledgeable, lacked that spiritual quality that drives home. He was uncannily less real, and I went up to bed uneasy and disturbed. "It is not age," I said to myself, "and assuredly it is not death he fears, although he spoke of disappearance. It is mental, in the deepest sense. It is what religious people would call soul. Something is happening to his soul."